welcome to Combat Thoughts. I'm Robbie.
I'm Lee.
And I'm Alex.
We're going to take a deeper look at culture and philosophy behind martial arts. So we're doing eras of the UFC and how that's affected the sport. Obviously, makes sense to go chronological, but you know what, Harry, if you've got down some eras that you've kind of mapped out, maybe we lay those out at the start. We'll interject if there's any others we think we should throw in, but I expect it's going to be pretty thorough.
Sure. So the bullet points for my notes are this, right? The eras of how MMA has been shaped by the UFC, and I've sort of included Strikeforce and the overarching Endeavor company in that, because obviously the new era has been heavily structured by Endeavor. So to me specifically, the UFC obviously started based on a one-night tournament idea, right? A one-night tournament format that was based around finding what the most prominent martial art was, right? Was that jiu-jitsu? Was that judo? Was that bare knuckle fighting? Was that karate, etc., etc., etc.? And the question was answered, relatively clinically, and that was that in that time, gi jiu-jitsu specifically, right, obviously, was the dominant fighting sport, and obviously from that we saw the explosion of Brazilian jiu-jitsu and the Gracie family and everything else. From then, I felt like when Lorenzo and Frank really heavily got involved with the UFC, we saw the UFC steal the good parts of boxing and then change some of the awful parts of boxing. So we entered an era where it became about rankings, it became about titles, it became about the best fighting the best at their prime time, rather than in almost the anti-boxing model, right? Where you've got a plethora of belts and random people can hold belts in random organizations that aren't necessarily championship caliber, whereas you were confident that at the time of that the UFC really solidified their ranking system and their weight divisions, the champion of that division was almost always one of the best fighters in that division at that time. And I think that's really how the UFC monopolized MMA so quickly, because they did their best to cultivate the best talent, put them in a division, and everyone fights to become the champion, right? And I think people liked that a lot because there was a very natural progression in the matchmaking. There was also, with moving on slightly to the Joe Silva and those times, is we saw very quickly a pattern emerging when it came to matchmaking. If you were a prospect, you'd be treated this way. If you were an aging fighter that was coming from Horizon or somewhere else, you were going to be treated this way. If you were a guy that has come in from another organization that's a really high-level fighter but is somebody in the middle pack, you're going to be treated this way, right? And I think that allowed fans to follow it very, very quickly. From then, I thought we saw, with the purchase of, with Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey and John Jones and whatever, we saw the birth of crossover stars, right? And I think that infected the UFC in a very negative way, in my opinion, in negative and positive ways. What we saw. So I'm going to hark back slightly to a story about Manchester United, right? So Manchester United, when they were managed by Alex Ferguson, there was a rule that there was no player bigger than the club. Right? If ever at any point you thought you were bigger than the club, you were sold. David Beckham is the greatest example of this. Right? There was a conversation between Alex Ferguson, David Beckham, and Ferguson said, "What do you want to be? A superstar or a footballer?" And Beckham said both. He was sold to Madrid the next transfer window. Right? That's just the way that business was done in that club. Ronda Rousey was bigger than the UFC. John Jones at a time was bigger than the UFC in the Nike era. Conor McGregor is unbelievably bigger than the UFC, right? So there came a time when there were very small percentages of fighters, but a small percentage of fighters that the UFC needed more than they needed the UFC. Right? And I think that developed us into a very different era of the UFC. That allowed Frank and Lorenzo, and I mean, it was probably Frank and Lorenzo's business plan from the start to take it on, make it massive, sell it for loads, move on to the next thing, right? That's generally what business people do. And they did that very well by, as I said, the ranking system, USADA testing, television deals, all of this sorts of stuff, unified rule sets, everything else, right? Mm-hmm. But the era that we're in right now is that of content, right? Gone are the days where it is about the best fighting the best. If that was the case, we would not have seen Masvidal and Usman a couple of weekends ago.
And there wouldn't be a BMF belt.
There wouldn't be a BMF belt. You wouldn't see conversations of Conor McGregor coming off a 2-fight losing streak and maybe going in straight for a belt, right? That wouldn't happen. Where in the Joe Silva era, there was no double champs, right?
Yeah.
In the Conor McGregor era, everyone's a double champ, right? DC, Amanda, GSP, Conor, etc., 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 right? So Izzy attempted it, obviously. Now that the ESPN deal has been signed, the UFC care less and less about pay-per-view buys, and pay-per-view buys were the main motivation for the best fights to come around, right? If you could market the number one contender versus the champion every month, you were almost guaranteed pay-per-view buys because you've got highlight reels, you've got brilliant promo packages, you've got this, that, and the next thing. Whereas now, okay, a similar model is brought in, Masvidal's flying knee, etc., etc. But other than that, what are you going to show? Him getting whacked by Stephen Thompson? Are you going to show the tough fight against Cerrone? No, you're not, right? You need highlight reels to sell these fights. And I think now we're in an era, in the same era that we are in the world, and that's an era of content. It's not an era of quality necessarily.
Yeah. Well, we've covered it off pretty thoroughly there. Before we get into too much more, because I think we're already alluding pretty heavily to how that may affect the sport. Probably best to take it back to the start, take it back through the whole journey. And I think it's probably should also be pointed out that the UFC has shaped MMA as a sport, but it's not the first. It's obviously not the first prize fighting in the world, and it's also not the first. And before MMA, you had lucha libre. Mm-hmm. That is the right one, isn't it? Not the Mexican
lucha
wrestling.
Libre. Yes. Oh no, it's Vale Tudo you're talking about.
No,
lucha Libre is Vale Tudo was the Brazilian MMA.
Doesn't matter. You know what? Not the Mexican
wrestling.
Could be both. Whatever the Brazilian for, I believe it's free form, and I guess a sort of more accurate translation for us would be no holds barred. Was the idea of it, and obviously that was, no time limit, just to the finish, whoever wins kind of situations. So that's kind of where the UFC was originally born from. And I think that kind of shows through quite well in what they were trying to do with the first UFC, because the first UFC had a real purpose to it. It was find the best martial art. So it's quite hard to say exactly how that. So I guess that it's quite obvious actually how that shaped initial perspectives on martial art, in that it caused Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to be popular as hell. I think if anything, the first UFC maybe didn't affected martial arts more than any other has done in the future. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see like where they took that. I mean, Alex, you got anything to throw in for the first one?
For the first one, I mean, just I think what you are referring to is Vale Tudo, which is like everything goes. And yeah, of course, that was, the first. Yeah, UFC wasn't the first people to ever come up with that idea. It's interesting to think about whether, I think as we progress further, I think it's a bit more interesting on how actually then the sport of MMA got shaped, because in the first instance of UFC 1, it's not necessarily that it was about the sport of MMA, right? It was more about
Who's the
just
best?
the fight between martial arts, and everyone was set in their own martial art to an extent. There was no mixing of styles within a fighter. It was like one fighter has this style and the other fighter has this style.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about those early ones is that they were obviously people were setting out to be the champion, but people were really setting out to prove that their martial art was the best. And I wonder at what point did it shift from I am a ninjutsu fighter. I want to prove that ninja is the best. When did it move through to I want to be an MMA fighter and I want to be, I want to prove that my gym is the best. And I'm not really sure at what point that transitioned, but obviously the UFC rolled on with events.
So I think if I may, then as we're moving now towards that, I think a very good point that Harry made during his sort of beginning, let's call it monologue. He talked about how the UFC took a problem that boxing had and essentially fixed it to an extent where they said, fuck all these belts from a million organizations. Let's create one organization where we have belt structures and different divisions in one organization, and we're going to have champions in those divisions. And I think perhaps as that started happening, this is when the sport became a thing. This is where the sport actually became the sport of MMA. I don't know what your views are.
Well,
Plus,
sorry, Harry, go ahead.
sure. I think the development of MMA from a personal competitor standpoint to say, okay, I want to be a mixed martial artist, probably didn't happen as consciously as we'd like to think it did.
Mm.
The guys that were in that tournament, right? They may not have been the pinnacle of each of those martial arts as a representation. However, they were guys that had competed often enough, right? Maybe not hoist, but often enough in their own discipline to be respected in their own fields, right? So what that would have done is when you see a kickboxing champion get triangled or have his back taken, what would become apparent is a reverberation throughout that sport, and it would split in halfway. One, people will be like, oh shit, we need to learn that because clearly I'm inadequate. This thing that I learned, that I have dedicated my life to, isn't just sufficient enough, right? And then the other side, they'd be like, that was just a bad actor, like our martial art will just win anyway, right? And when that's multiplied over a tournament fashion and multiple skill sets and multiple styles are shown to have inadequacies, I think naturally you will have seen that people will have cross-trained almost immediately, especially when you're going to be then in a competition with other different styles. You're going to have to train to try and beat those styles. Whereas in the first UFC, I think it was very much a bring the bag of chips that you've got, put them on the table, and let's see who's got more.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the real difference would have been in those people. So people at that point would have been faced with a choice of either you're going to stay within your discipline and become as good as you can at your discipline, but those people who are motivated to do a certain discipline by the idea of becoming a good fighter, they clearly would have said, right, well, I've not got the skills to become a good fighter. I'm going to have to branch out. So I do wonder, I guess it depends how many people in each discipline would have had each different motivational factor to move towards. And it's probably those ones in it probably helped with jiu-jitsu not only being very successful, but the whole the whole Gracie challenge, like come in and fight, like that would have attracted people who wanted to come in and fight rather than come in and learn jiu-jitsu, right? They would have attracted people who want to come in, which may be why jiu-jitsu was so and still to this day has such a close relationship with MMA, whereas boxing and other sports for now, yes. I mean, obviously stuff evolves over time, and we are talking about things that happened 30 years ago 25 years ago, right?
Yeah,
So
it's like 27, 28 years ago now. Yeah.
it's something around that. Like whatever it is. I mean, stuff's going to evolve over time, but I mean, I think historically, jiu-jitsu has had a very close relationship to MMA, and I don't think that's purely because jiu-jitsu won the first UFC competition. UFC competition. I guess it's just the first UFC, isn't it? Otherwise, I'm just repeating myself. But I think just before we move on to sort of the later bits, it is interesting to point out that I think that it's something about the UFC in particular, and maybe it's just the large global stage that it was on that did actually create MMA as we know it today. Because, like we said, people had been doing Vale Tudo for years, decades beforehand, and yet somehow people only suddenly got awakened to the fact that you can grapple and strike, sort of thing. Something about those early events sort of woke people up.
I suspect that. I think the thing we have to remember too is that obviously Vale Tudo isn't just originating from Brazil. It would have been everywhere in a multifaceted name.
Mm-hmm.
However, the difference when you from a local Vale Tudo tournament on the beach somewhere where there's just lads scrapping, right? When you put multiples of millions of marketing dollars behind something like UFC 1, right? It's bound to catch more eyes, right? Now, obviously, the real opening for the UFC is popularized. We know it's the first tough. It's Stephen Bonner versus Forrest Griffin, and maybe we can talk about that fight a little bit and what that did for MMA as well. But it's when you put something in front of millions of people, even if the percentage is 10%, that's still a large number of people that are then going to consume that thing instead of some lads scrapping on a beach in Brazil, regardless of how historic it is, regardless of who the competitors are, right? We've seen the videos of Hickson going and fighting in the sand and punching some guy up as he's triangling him or whatever it is. I think that the awakening came more due to marketing than it did come more from oh my god, like the UFC has shown us something inside this magical octagon.
Yeah, I mean that's true. And it is interesting the marketing back in the day and how it's transitioned through to now. And the fact that back in the day it was come and see some violence, some real
as real as it gets.
As real as it gets, some real Dave O'Donnell style, yeah. And then through to nowadays where it's kind of fringe but kind of accepted. It's not sort of prime. Well, actually, to an extent, yeah, it is getting on the BBC now. It is becoming more and more popular and more widely accepted. But I think that's something to discuss sort of in the middle of this. But I guess that takes us then from that initial UFC through towards like the second iteration of it, where they started. Well, I guess they started trying to make money out of it, and they started actually getting a bit more popular and actually getting a few more people involved in the sport.
So would you say that was the Harry? Would that be the Zuffa era, the sort of the time when?
Yeah, almost certainly, right. The Zuffa era really is what made the UFC. I think the difference, right, and something that's really important to point out is that at the start, the UFC was a gimmick, right? It was a gimmick that then became a fight organization. The gimmick was, we've got this 350-pound sumo Donny, and we've got this tiny 145-pound lad in a gi, right? And we're going to put them together and see what happens. Like, this is no disrespect to certain promotions that do this, but we see freak show matches all the time, right? Kimbo Slice Data 5,000. We see, fucking Pudzianowski go in and have 15 seconds of cardio against some random guy, some bin man that they brought in from off the street and paid him a couple of grand, right? Like, the freak show fights, fucking Hongman Choi, Fedor Emelianenko. Like, if you want a freak show fight, go and watch that, right? Like, there are promotions that have done this, and though to me, they're like harking back to the gimmicks that were UFC 1, and they're the gimmicks of like David versus Goliath, really, right? That's what we're doing here. However, what the UFC saw an opportunity, or Zuffa saw an opportunity to do, is take the UFC and make it a legitimate business. And that's what they did. And I think without Zuffa, MMA as a thing definitely doesn't exist in the fashion that we know it to be today. And I think it definitely is in a much different light.
Well, if nothing else, they, again, like we said earlier, brought it to just more eyes. Without creating a sort of legitimacy around it, it would have basically just stayed as a fringe, weird sport. More eyes on a sport will cause a sport to get more membership and to cause a sport to develop. So, yeah, of course, that kind of thing, that marketing tactic from Zuffa, and of course, would have developed the sport a great deal. But I think you hit the nail on the head.
But I also think it's not. I mean, yes, the eyes are important, but I think there was deliberation there. There was deliberate action to make it a sport. It was because of the
100%.
USADA, the Athletic Commission involvement, and all those things.
Way before then, we're talking about a unified rule set, right? They actually brought a rule set in, right? The first rule set was basically don't kick each other in the bollocks, right?
I think you couldn't bite, and that was about it.
Yeah, you couldn't bite, but there was like fish hooking and eye gouging, and all this shit was like relatively legal. It was potentially.
I actually think you could hit them in the bollocks. I think there's a video of someone. What is it? They've got them almost in a scarf hole. No, he's like across the guy's chest. His legs are here, and he grabs the cup, moves it, and they go for the shots.
That's ruthless.
That's a little aside, anyway.
But yeah, I think there were a few pivotal figures, right? The first one is the likes of Lorenzo and Frank. Then there's obviously Dana for all of his faults. Did amazing work. But Big John McCarthy, people like these guys, right, that helped to form the first set of rules and really campaigned against the board of the UFC, like the 12 to 9 elbows, 12 to 6 elbows, sorry. That's still a ludicrous rule, but exists. And, what happened, I think Alex is absolutely right. What happened was there was a real drive to take human cockfighting, as it was called, right, or cage fighting, and make it a legitimate revenue stream and a legitimate sport. And the way that they did that, as Alex has alluded to, are rankings, the anti-boxing decisions, the USADA testing later on, the
gloves.
Gloves. The sponsorship availability, obviously the media and the marketing and these sorts of things, but also the acquiring of things like Strikeforce, things like WEC, things like the collaboration with Ryzen at the time, right? Because Ryzen just had a way bigger fan base. And, there was really clever, intentional movements made by Zuffa to make this a legitimate sport and the polar opposite to what it was in UFC 1.
Yeah. Do you think anything was lost doing that at that point? Because I do think at some point, obviously, the increasing business focus and the increasing angle on making money has affected MMA to an extent. I wonder if it happened that early on or if it was all beneficial at that point.
Well, I mean, we've heard Dana say multiple times that they were 150 million, 200 million in the hole before Bonner and Griffin, right? And they were ready to pull the plug. And they were like, forget this, we've lost too much. I think it was 30 million. I don't know. It was a lot of money anyway, right? And Lorenzo and Frank were saying, look, this isn't going anywhere. We're not doing anything. We're just losing money left, right, and center. We're going to have to pull the plug. And then Griffin and Bonner happened, right? So I think to be truly honest, the Zuffa era of MMA was the greatest era of MMA and or the UFC that we have seen so far.
Agreed.
And the reason for that is because it felt like, yes, there was an attempt to make this a legitimate business. Yes, the goal was to make revenue, it was to make profit, it was to make the return on investment good enough for Dana and Lorenzo and Frank. However, it felt like what was happening was they were attempting to steer a sport that they'd fallen in love with in the right path, right? Because as we've already said, they didn't make money until the end of Tough 1, right? That's a long time to be shoveling millions of dollars into something to make no money.
When was Tough 1?
Oh, Jesus, I don't know the year. Somebody can pull
Go
that
on,
shit
we'll
up,
go-
Jamie.
Oh,
Yeah, that's it. I'm just actually trying to see where it was. 2005. I think it was around
2005.
2005. That's when the first one was.
Right, so and UFC 1 was 1993.
That's a long fucking time.
Yeah, and I mean
12 years.
the actual UFC was bought in 2001 by Zuffa.
Yeah, so you've got 4 years of putting shows on once every month, once every 2 months.
Just tanking money.
And fucking tanking money.
Did you know that Lorenzo was a former member of the Nevada State Athletic Commission? Because I didn't know that.
I did not know that. That's not
That's
a surprise.
quite interesting. Yeah,
It's
I'm
not
not surprised either.
Yeah, interesting that he was involved in it beforehand.
But they're all massive boxing guys, right? They're all massive boxing guys.
Everyone knows about Dana being a boxing freak.
Well, you can also see the influence of boxing on MMA. I mean, the rounds, the ring girls,
The 10-point must system.
10-point must system.
the 10-point must system. There's a huge influence. And actually, those 3 points that we mentioned are very, very unnecessary for the sport. Listen to GSP talk about it. He hates the round system. He thinks it's stupid. I'm inclined to agree. But I don't think it's going anywhere. The ring girls obviously aren't needed in relation to the sport. And the 10-point must system, I think is a terrible way to do it. It's really stupid. There has to be... We're going to get into a whole thing on the rules, but it frustrates me a lot that winning by a big margin and winning by a little margin both get you a 10-9 unless you absolutely dominate. So,
well, I mean, less so in the new scoring system. Like the ability to give out 10-8s are... We see a lot more 10-8s now than we used to, right? A 10-8 back in the day was somebody was dead on the canvas and his team had picked him up to finish the round, right? And they were like, maybe that's a 10-8.
It's better, but I think it could be a lot better still.
Sure, I mean, I take your point about the 10-point must system not being the most prominent for MMA, because obviously the 10-point must system is based on boxing, right? And that fits much better to boxing because the rules are much easier to apply. However, I'm not sure that we have a system in place outside of a Ryzen or a One that's all that beneficial to MMA scoring either, right?
Yeah,
That's fair.
I mean, I really quite like the idea. I mean, because why is it that the UFC became that successful? And it's interesting to think about whether that improvement on the way that it was structured as a sort of organized sport with with different weight classes and so on. But I think the weight classes and things like that, they actually came before the Zuffa era, so wouldn't necessarily...
Sorry, man, it's like you're trying to have this serious conversation and Harry's carrying around a fucking dog in the background.
I'm trying to keep it going. But if anyone's watching this on YouTube, you're gonna have a fucking good time.
Oh boy!
So you should watch this on YouTube if you ever listen to it as a podcast. But I was just saying that I think, like, for example, we're talking about how Zuffa is influencing the sport, but I think the UFC influenced UFC and then therefore the sport, but for example, things like the weight classes and so on, I think that actually came before the Zuffa era.
They changed them though.
But that was changed. And so, they expanded, right? They expanded the weight classes. And
yes.
but I think, you know, if you look at, for example, because why is it that the UFC became so successful? I mean, one could be that it's very interesting to have mixed martial arts involved. That could definitely be it. I think another thing is that there was money, like you talked about, Harry, you know, and you, Robbie, as well. Like if you pump money in, you're gonna and you create a product, it will grow. If you pump enough money, most likely it will end up growing. But I think there was, like, you know, from a very like entrepreneurial standpoint, I really like this idea that you put across, Harry. Is like they did look at boxing and they said, you know, what the fuck, what are these stupid things that we don't like, and let's get rid of those. Although we might now disagree about the rule sets and ring girls and whatever, but some things that were, you know, inherently bad to boxing were not taken forward to the UFC, and that surely contributed to that success that Zuffa saw.
Oh, but I think that some of those things that we disagree with in terms of our silly for MMA were brought on for very smart reasons, and
Agree.
it was the whole angle of trying to turn it into a business. And I do accept that turning it into a business is entirely linked to its popularity and its and the fact that it grew as a sport. So I do appreciate that maybe some of these were better for the sport to be included long term. But I think the reason for rounds, the reason for ring girls, and the reason for gloves is because it makes them more money for whatever reason. That's why they're there. You know, the ring, the rounds give you more. You know, it gives you more engagement. It gives you more ability to bet, and more ability to advertise. The ring girls obviously bring a different appeal to it, and the gloves make it. Well, they do two things. They firstly make it more appealing from a gore perspective. Well, actually, three things. More appealing from a gore perspective, allows your fighters to keep fighting for longer because they don't break their hands. It just damages their brains more, and that doesn't matter until 20 years down the line. Honest point, like it doesn't matter for the UFC until 20 years down the line. But also the fact that it encourages striking. And I think maybe we at some point skipped over that in that the UFC clearly prefers striking and prefers marketing striking because it's easier and it's easier for people to get. And because it makes for more exciting fights. So I do think that's why why rounds and gloves are probably so favored by the UFC because they do create exciting fights and they drive MMA towards a more striking based art.
I think that I think exciting is a variable. I think the angle that I would take on it is if you take MMA and you want to make it a legitimate business, you have to market it to your 9 to 5 worker that knows nothing about martial arts, knows nothing about fighting, but has an innate human understanding that fighting is a cerebral part of our anatomy and our history, right? So you need to make it raw enough that somebody can connect with it at almost at a soul level, right? Which is why we see them fighting in their underwear. And yes, you then have to then add on things that make it digestible to a non-layman fan. So you're marketing to the men, frankly, of America that are between 18 and 45, right? So what do you want to see? Well, you're going to see girls in not a lot of clothes walking around with a number that they don't even read, right? Rounds, because as you say, we need somebody to bet on a round. We're going to have people that need to go and get a beer at the stadium and maybe they can get it inside a minute or they think they can. Food break, toilet break, whatever. And also
Slow-mo recaps.
Exactly, right? And what you can also have inside that time is if you've got a round that's 15 minutes long, as we saw in Pancrase, right? The fights are very different. right? They're very, very different. People pace themselves. You don't see as many quick finishes. Whereas fighters know, if I've got 3 5-minute rounds, I can, and I'm supremely confident in my gas tank, I could put a lot into that first round and know that I've got a minute's break or 2 minutes break to recover in that time, right? So it's intelligent because it doesn't force action, but it promotes action. But the whole thing, all of the things that we've talked about, a rule system that's recognized in boxing, gloves, as you say, it protects fighters' hands, but not enough that it doesn't stop knockouts and these sorts of things. It doesn't dissuade grappling per se, but it means that if you have, and this is a point I thought as well, if you have let's say it was, God, I don't know, Brian Ortega of the modern era, right, versus a straight striker back in the tough one days, like a Stephan Bonner, right? Let's just say, if it's those two guys, even with the glove, right, it's made to seem like it's a disadvantageous thing for grapplers. Brian Ortega would still wrap Stephan Bonner up like a glove, right? It wouldn't even be close.
But it is disadvantageous for grapplers, all the same.
I think it changes grappling because I think in some ways it makes grappling easier because let's say you want to control somebody, right? Well, you've got a sweaty hand or a dry glove, right? If you're making grips on the ground to control somebody, grabbing a glove, and even without the ref seeing, inside a glove, makes a grip far easier than if you're grabbing a sweaty person. Now, yes, when it comes to finishing submissions like rear nakeds and all this sort of stuff, I'm with you 100%. But I think there are elements of grappling that are made easier by a glove and elements of grappling that are certainly not made easier by a glove. But to your point, I think you're absolutely right that they want to promote a striking-based sport, which, funnily enough, is not what MMA is at the moment. But
yeah, and I mean, I guess, I guess actually, when we move on to the future changes, actually, what it's changing is the athletes and maybe perception of MMA rather than MMA as a sport. All that's really changing now in terms of MMA as a sport is the fact that so many people are doing it that techniques develop and it's more organic. What I think is interesting about the fact they brought in the rule sets and the rounds and things like that is that did actually shape the future sort of course of MMA. Because like you said about the resting, and the fact that it's a 3-minute round, and then you get 2 minutes, then you get a minute rest, or sorry, 5-minute round, minute rest, and it's quite quick. It does create a very aggressive. It promotes a very aggressive style. My coach at Warriors Academy would often point out that it doesn't happen in boxing. That even in the amateur, especially in the amateur fights, okay, if you go to UCMMA or WCMMA and you watch those fights, what happens is those early ones, bell goes, people come out and they go out and they swing for the fences immediately. And I know this isn't as pronounced in the professional MMA and it's not as pronounced later on because you're going to get countered. But it is still true that, people don't do feeling out rounds in MMA, really.
unless you're Jose Aldo.
Yeah, I mean, it does happen from time to time, but only with the championship fights because you can't afford to drop a round. And even then, it's not normally the whole round. It's normally the first minute, 2 minutes, and then you're going. But it is interesting that I think the reason they brought in rounds and things like that is to create more of a spectacle and more ability to advertise. But actually, the effect is that MMA fighters are encouraged to be extremely aggressive. And that's another reason I think it plays into the striking side of things. Is that, and it's the fact that, I mean, yeah, again, like the gloves being brought in, fine. I take your point. It changes grappling rather than purely disadvantages it. But the fact is that it does encourage striking, even if it doesn't disencourage grappling, because without the gloves, you will break your hands. And suddenly there's more development being put into the striking side of things because it's a more relevant part for the sport. if you see what I mean, because were the gloves not there, much more time would be spent training MMA in a grappling perspective, because it would be more important, and we would see less development in, calf kicks might only happen in another 10 years because you'd half the rate of progression, whereas we might find some wonders of grappling grappling MMA nowadays that we don't currently have, because those things were brought in to make it more palatable for the public.
I think there is a relatively simple counterpoint to that, though, and that's that the natural inclination for somebody that isn't as proficient in striking, if they're entering a promotion that promotes striking, isn't to get better at striking. It's to be dominant enough in your grappling that you negate the need for striking. A la Habib Nurmagomedov, Kamaru Usman, GSP. I mean, okay, GSP was a phenomenal karate striker and whatever. BJ Penn, all of these guys, right? Like, if you Brian Ortega up until his last fight, frankly, yeah, like, I think that what's really interesting, and I know this is probably nothing to do with how, I mean, I guess it is. Like, the thing that I find really interesting about MMA is that the bedrock of MMA is grappling. And I mean grappling less about, arm bars and rear naked chokes and whatever, but about positionally dominating your opponent in grappling exchanges. So the most dominant champions that we've seen have had excellent grappling, either defensive grappling or offensive grappling. Right? Anderson Silva was a motherfucker to take down, and when you did take him down, he was going to try and you ass Chael Sonnen. Habib Nurmagomedov, John Jones, GSP, Kamaru Usman now, all the guys that have been, Demetrius Johnson, the guys that have been dominant, Ronda Rousey, might I add, right, have been dominant grapplers in some fashion. All of them have different aspects of that. However, the center of MMA, whether the UFC want to admit it or not, and actually I think they have begun to admit it, because you see them putting more marketing dollars behind guys like Habib, guys like Kamaru Usman. I think they're starting to understand that grappling isn't going anywhere. If anything, grappling is the key to MMA, and it's the elements that you add on top that you're going to see make the flashy highlight reels.
Yeah, well, I like the idea of the UFC having a renewed focus on the grappling side of things.
Makes amazing stuff for your articles, right?
It will indeed. Although those articles have started to dry up a little bit recently, but that's that's a story for another day.
I mean, to play a bit of a devil's advocate on this, I think to an extent, I agree with what you're saying with regards to how the UFC is putting more dollars towards people who are dominant grapplers. But so my question is, though, is that really because they're grapplers, or is it just because they're dominant people? And also, for example, someone like Kamaru Usman, he's like an African champion. He's from Nigeria. Mm-hmm. So that's actually, when you look at how they market him, that's more where their focus is. It's less on his ability to be, dominant in his grappling exchanges, or like, this is where I think I would perhaps go a little bit more on Robbie's side on this case, because it seems to me that the UFC, when they do all their highlight reels and the way they promote things, it's still very much it is a bit more skewed towards the striking.
For sure. However, I think so. When I said they're starting to come around to it, I mean in the last 3 years, they're starting to come around to it. Because when you see the hype around Habib and Kamaru, yes, you're right. It's not about what you see in the highlight reel for Habib is the knockdown of McGregor, right? You see the choke of McGregor. You see the Kimura of Michael Johnson. You see Edson Barboza rise to his feet after he's just been dominated for the 4th round. And, this is what you see. But the words being used are dominant.
Yes.
Right? Words like dominance. Now, it's very hard to be a dominant striker unless you're Anderson Silva or Israel Adesanya or early Conor McGregor or these outliers.
Yeah.
However, I think that the use of these words are starting to pertain to an understanding that grappling has become the most important part of MMA. Now, I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that the UFC are happy with that, because they're certainly not, right?
Yeah.
Certainly not. They were more. How many times did you see Jorge Masvidal knock out Ben Askren with a flying knee? How many times?
Fuck me.
Right, thousands, right? Thousands and thousands of times did you see that short 10-second clip appear everywhere? How many times did you see Alistair Overeem get knocked out by Francis Ngannou?
Exactly. And just
Enough.
just to add to that, who was in the UFC games recently? It was Masvidal and fucking
Israel
Israel
Adesanya.
Adesanya.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Absolutely, absolutely. However, the UFC, I think, are slowly, and this is maybe an incorrect point. However, I feel like the UFC are now in an era where they're forced by their athletes less than they ever have been because of the ESPN era, because of they just need to put cards on, right? They just need to put fights on. Now, how that retains fans, we'll talk about that later, I suppose. But the more that MMA becomes about grappling, the less the UFC have to promote about striking. So they then have to make a choice, right? Do they embrace grappling and put some promotional dollars behind it and whatever, or do they not? Right, and I think that's going to be a pivotal point in what happens in the next sort of 5 years with the UFC specifically.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see where it goes. I think I'm kind of leaning on the side of they are promoting Habib and Usman because they're champions or were champions, rather than because they are dominant grapplers. But yeah, I mean, I think that they have to. I think that, maybe they're not choosing to promote them because they're grapplers, but at the end of the day, they are the champions. They are the champions by their grappling ability.
Mm-hmm.
They're forced into promoting grappling more than that, and maybe they'll actually learn how to promote grappling well, which would be nice for the next
It is
few years.
interesting though that you see it with the approach of Kamaru. It used to be like the UFC was like just not interested in this guy, but now whether it's because he's a champion or because he's just showing fuck this guy is just dominant, full stop. Striking, grappling, he's just a dominant guy. And that's in itself something that we can market.
For sure. It's for sure that.
Yeah, and I think that it's more that than the fact that he's a champion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point is going to come. Like, let's just quickly run through some of the champions that we've got right now. Yeah, Jan Blachowicz at 205. Francis Ngannou doesn't know how to grapple at all. However, what was the big point of contention in the Stipe fight most recently? Because it wasn't the knockout; it was the fact that he sprawled the single leg. Right? Now, obviously, we know that because that was the massive hole in his game last time, right? He essentially just got taken down at will, and everyone was asking questions like, oh, shit, is he going to be able to defend the takedowns? What's going to happen? What are we going to see? Turns out he's learned single leg sprawls. Fantastic, right? Good luck to anyone trying to take him down now. You then go down Jan Blachowicz 205, right? The big talking point, well, there was two big talking points in the Israel Adesanya fight. The first one was how patient he was, how well calculated he was. The second was he managed to take Izzy down, right? In Israel Adesanya, what we're saying his 185 run is he's got unbelievable takedown defense. Right? He's really good at getting back up if he's put down to a knee, blah, 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 blah. This allows him to do the flashy stuff that we saw, right? You then go to Kamaru Usman. I don't need to say anymore. Habib Nurmagomedov, who, is technically still the champion. There is no champion at 155. But, let's look at the 155-pound title fight that's coming up. Oliveira, grappler. Michael Chandler, grappler, right? 145. Max Holloway, amazing takedown defense. Alex Volkanovski, great grappler with some striking on top. Brian Ortega, who's right up there. I mean, he's a great jiu-jitsu artist. I wouldn't say he's a grappler, but you know what I mean, right?
So basically, what I think we're kind of getting to is this fact that although the UFC has a preference,
Yes,
and clearly over time it has shown that preference,
yes,
we're getting to a point where they have no fucking choice.
absolutely, absolutely.
They have to accept that grappling is a fucking serious part of the sport, and you cannot escape from it no longer.
Absolutely, and I think that what the era that we are in now, and I understand we're going to have to backtrack a little bit before Endeavour and whatever, but the era that we are in now is MMA is now its own organism, right? Gone are the days. I think when Stephen Thompson retires, gone are the days, and Damian Maia obviously he's got one more fight, but you know what I mean. Gone are the days that you're going to have essentially single martial arts specialists competing at the highest level of MMA. Gone. Right? Because Khabib's now retired, right? So I can say that. Since the likes of Demetrius Johnson, Zabit Magomed-Sharipov, Arman Saryukian, all of these guys that are coming through, they understand that they're developing skills in MMA, not boxing, not kickboxing, not a mishmash of the others, MMA. If you go and watch an amateur fight now, any UC MMA show, as Robbie said, and you go and look at an amateur bout from 15 years ago, the difference is insane, right? I know a couple of AMI guys. I'm sure you two know a couple of AMI guys. At no point are they like, oh yeah, gonna go in and do some kickboxing. That just doesn't happen, right? The blend, MMA is now its entirely own organism, right? And that organism is derived around grappling, in my opinion. Whether that be open area grappling, cage wrestling, actual grappling on the ground, clinch work, etc., etc., right? There are elements that have spawned from various things, but we're now seeing evolutions in the martial art of MMA. I know that's a really, really poor sentence, but you get my point. And the UFC will have to cotton on to that because they're the authors of that, essentially.
Well, now we're not talking so much about how the UFC has influenced MMA, but rather how MMA is influencing the UFC.
But I think though my point is entirely that MMA wouldn't be what it is if it wasn't for the UFC.
No,
right?
of course.
You know, and I think that the reason why MMA is the organism that it is right now is because of the UFC, right? Don't get me wrong. This is no disrespect to a Ryzen, a Pancrase, a WEC, a Strikeforce, a Bellator, any of these, right? Nowhere near any disrespect whatsoever. However, it goes without saying that the UFC is the premier organization when it comes to mixed martial arts and has been pretty much since the Zuffa era, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean,
maybe outside of Ryzen. So, you know, when you have the premier organization, just like the Premier League sets the tone for generally how football is played in England, right?
Yeah.
In the same vein that how everyone looks, even like, let's take fucking Michael Chandler. Michael Chandler wouldn't say the UFC's name until he was a free agent. And then he was like, yeah, all I've wanted to do my entire career is fight for the UFC. Let's go. Right. And again, that's no disrespect to a Bellator whatsoever. It's just the way that these things happen. Yeah. If you take a kid off the street and you say to them, like, do you fancy playing in Sky Bet League 2? Or do you fancy playing in Premier League? They're always going to say the Premier League, right? So the UFC has allowed MMA to evolve in the way that it has, and it's almost pushed MMA to evolve in the way it has. And that then ripples out to the other organizations. Because the amount of people, like, think about the amazing minds that have been involved in the UFC, just from a coaching perspective, right? Those guys are the people that really have been brought in to this thing. Like, I could continue on for 15 minutes, but I'm going to let somebody else talk.
That's all right. That's fine. I don't know how much more there is to say on how the UFC has actually influenced MMA as a sport or at least as a martial art directly, unless we've got some other big points. I think we've kind of covered that side of things off, and I'm not sure if we want to focus at this point more on
The later stages,
the sort of social and
and content era, as Harry calls it, which I think is a good way to call it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think before the content era, obviously, there was, as you described it, I'm not really sure exactly what. I guess it's within the Zuffa era. It was the era of almost like fair matchups and steady climbing of the ranks.
Joe Silver, yeah.
Yeah, and obviously that. Well, I mean, by its nature, that sort of core fairness of that time didn't really not that it couldn't generate big characters, but it didn't incentivize trash talking nearly as much, and it didn't incentivize big characters and freak show fights in the same way that it does now. I mean, who would have come through in that era? When would have Chael Sonnen come
Chuck
in and stuff
Liddell,
like that?
Tito Ortiz, Chael, Anderson,
No,
GSP.
so this is the thing about like Chuck Liddell, for example. Star as he wasn't going in there. He was a star because he went in there and knocked people out. He wasn't a star because he went in there trash talking. Chael Sonnen, yes, very much trash talking, brash, like a big brash figure. But he was a bit more of a minority. Yeah, yeah, fine. Not that they didn't happen, but it was much less incentivized that they happened.
I mean, yeah, I agree. I think you are making a good point. It is true that during that era, before, I mean, we can call it the Conor McGregor era. Before the Conor McGregor era, it was actually a bit more about the sport in some strange sense. That's how it seemed to be. And I think, as you said, Harry, before, that was the golden era. And it was to me as well. And it's, and then at some stage we entered something different.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure. I mean, I guess Chael have kicked it off to an extent, but there was a definite point where it seems to become more about how many eyes you can get on you outside of the cage rather than how many eyes you can get on you inside of the cage. Do you not think?
Surely that point came when McGregor showed how successful that can be, because then
I think that started with Ric Flair, to be truly honest with you. You know, we give a lot of credit to Conor McGregor, right? But Chael stole it from wrestling, right? He stole it from pro wrestling. He stole it from Ric Flair. He stole it from Stone Cold. He stole it from The Rock, right? This trash talk, like Muhammad Ali was the same, right? What would he say? Like, if you even dream about beating me, wake up and apologize. You know, nobody just says that to another person, right? So,
of course,
in MMA specifically, I think Robbie actually made a fantastic point, and that point is that it became, the UFC was designed to do two things, right? You had one side, which, as I say, was designed about getting the sport as a sport to be popular, but the root of popularity is dividends, right? So if you can derive dividends from popularity, perfect. And what we began to realize, we being the UFC board, right? Imagine we as the Zuffa board began to realize that the more popular our fighters were, the more money that we would get. So when Chael goes to Brazil and calls them all filthy animals, and the place goes absolutely mental, right? And everyone's then going to tune in for the rematch to see Chael get his head kicked off, right? What we realize is that, I mean, let's not get derailed into a social media type thing, but anger sells, emotion sells, right? So whether you're a Chael that incites fucking racial violence, essentially, right? Or whether you're a Ronda Rousey that looks a certain way and acts a certain way, and that derives popularity. Whether you're a Conor, whether you're a John Jones that has a Nike deal, that's 1 minute a God-loving person, and the next minute, 16 cocaine lines down, hiding underneath the gym cage to hide from USADA. Allegedly. What became an understanding is that these guys, all of them in some fashion, are unhinged, right? That's why they go and fight in an octagon behind a locked door. But that they had personalities. And what became brilliant as a marketing strategy is if we look at basketball, NFL, boxing to some extent, we don't get to see characters. The questions are always the same. There's no fluidity in the ability and the autonomy of a fighter to be themselves, right? Look no further than Diego fucking Sanchez if you want a personality, right? The UFC understood that personality sold, and they allowed it to flourish. Now, okay, we didn't really hit the true big time until we found Conor McGregor, but we were pretty fucking close with the likes of John Jones, with the likes of Ronda Rousey, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what I think the shift was. I know what you're saying about it coming all from the... Obviously, yeah, it did come from pro wrestling. It did come from Chael Sonnen. I have to be honest, coming into the sport a bit after Chael was significant, to be honest. So I'm a little unclear. Was Chael getting title shots earlier than maybe a lot of people thought he should, based on how he was talking? Or,
yeah, I mean, Chael was an average fighter.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess in that case, Chael is probably the guy who kicked that off within the UFC, and I think that's where the shift is. It's where people are getting title shots and they're getting pushed up the rankings based on things that aren't to do with fighting, and I don't think that happened beforehand.
I mean,
irrelevant
you
of
also
who the
have
superstars were.
We also can't, forget people like Quinton Jackson.
Of course.
Because
imagine calling him Quinton. Imagine calling him his fucking Catholic name.
I know. Okay, sorry, Rampage Jackson.
Yeah.
Look, I think it's there have been, trash talking has been part of the UFC.
Ask Nick Diaz.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like what I mean is in that era before Conor McGregor, it happened even between just on a normal scale between fighters, it would happen, and I think it's not necessarily that it was invented by someone like Chael or then Chael taking it. It's been prominent around, but what's interesting is that when it really kicked off and when it really then started having an influence on everyone else, because it's like with it's like when you're trying to for example, leg locks in MMA, it's like until something becomes so successful in the sport, it doesn't change it enough that everyone else starts doing it. Like right now, we're still at the stage where leg locks are not really being utilized to their great extent in MMA, but we know that in BJJ, they are the shit. But like what I'm trying to say with the trash talking is like no one was really directing their
the success had to be demonstrated before
there had to be
so
like
popular.
Exactly, because now in the era that we are now, it's so prominent, and fighters, the new fighters, upcoming fighters, they really understand the idea that they need to make a name for themselves, and they need to a brand.
So I think, Frank Shamrock is going to be really angry with you for saying that leg locks in MMA don't exist, because he was straightforward.
No, I'm not saying they didn't exist. I'm not saying they didn't exist.
But I think the big thing when it comes to trash talking, we named a couple of people there, right? Rampage, Nick Diaz, Chael Sonnen. If you listen to Nick Diaz talk, you could listen to him talk for an hour and a half and realize that you've understood nothing that he said. and the same with Rampage, frankly. Like these guys, Chael was able to trash talk in a way that was easily communicable across the spectrum of audience, right? He was able to deliver a line that was both emotive but blasphemous but funny in the same way, right? Which is one of the reasons why people loved Conor. It was because if you were in a schoolyard argument and people were just shouting horrible things at each other, generally people aren't all that attracted to it until you start throwing hands. But if you've got a guy that's taking the piss out of somebody and it's really funny but really degrading to the other person at the same time, that's the person that you stand behind, and that's the person you want to watch, right? It just so happened that Conor took it to another couple of levels, right? He was the first person that used mental warfare as a weapon at the level that we saw. Never in the UFC's history did we have somebody pick a round, pick a shot, and then actually do it. We didn't then see him pick times and do it. We didn't have fighters tell you exactly how a fight would go and then actually do that. And never have we ever seen Jose Aldo explode out of the gates like he did. Never have we seen Eddie Alvarez paralyzed from start to finish of a performance. And that's taking nothing away from Conor's technical abilities as soon as the octagon closes. However, in the same vein that people used to talk about Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali, that they'd lost the fight before they'd even got in the ring, a lot of the work was done by Conor before he made that walk. And that was the first time we saw the ability to negotiate a fight before you enter the octagon to that scale, right?
Yeah, I mean, before this becomes a Conor McGregor focused podcast, I guess what we're really talking about here is the shift towards the kind of stardom era. Because,
Brands.
yeah, like you said earlier, it was about brand as well. And I think that was a good point. It's not just about trash talk. That's why Rousey and John Jones are so significant within the era we're talking about. John
Absolutely.
Jones with his persona beforehand about, with his Nike deal and everything. And Rousey for everything she was, not just the dominating fighter, but she was... It was a whole different angle from sort of the women's perspective, and the fact that she was a female fighter
An Olympian.
and an Olympian in a popular way that other female fighters had been quite. Other female fighters were only really liked sort of within the sport. Sort of people in the know would like Misha Tate. Joe Blogs on the street would have no idea who they were. I think this is the sort of time we're talking about, the sort of stardom era, and probably when individual fighters had the most power within the UFC. It's kind of shifted away from that to an extent now with the ESPN era, partly because they just need to get fights on the table, and partly because the UFC has done such a good job of marketing the UFC rather than fighters. It has, to an extent, detracted from fighter power in negotiations with the UFC.
I feel like that's conscious too. I feel like that's a conscious decision from the UFC, because the things that I wrote down as sort of the negative things from the UFC's perspective of how they've shaped MMA is there's never been a union and will never be a union in our lifetime, I imagine. Contractual agreements, a lot of them aren't even legally binding, and yet we see fighters signing them. Pay structures, right? Intellectual property rights, image rights, brand rights, all of these things have been very quickly identified by the UFC as loopholes to their bottom line and eradicated as much as possible. So, to your point, I think Conor McGregor posed an absolute yin and yang for the UFC. Conor McGregor was exactly what the UFC needed and everything they didn't need at the same time, right? Because what Conor offered, what John Jones offered, what Ronda offered, and just to go back to that Ronda point, Ronda was the first female fighter that broke out of the sexy girl fighting shell, right? She was dominant. She was confident. She was an Olympian. She was an athlete. She was a fighter as well. She also was more than happy if you found her on a Sunday afternoon helping out her chickens in a farm, right? Like that was Ronda rather than just the, pretty girl in cage fighting, lol. Right? And frankly, I mean, that's what it was, right? There was a brilliant article. I can't remember who wrote it, but a brilliant article that was out recently and interviewed lots and lots of female fighters about their experiences up until the point of the present day, up until the point where Zhang Weili and Rose and Valentina and Jessica Andrade were, right at the top of the card. And some of their statements were not shocking at all, but still very sad. Anyway, I'm derailing slightly. Like, what Conor offered to the UFC, what Ronda offered, what John offered, was an ability to cross over. But the danger for that is that they cross over, and that other fighters understand that you can cross over, and that there is more money than a 10 and 10, a 17 and 17. There is an ability to negotiate with the UFC that you get more of the pie than you think you're worth, right? The UFC, for everything that it's done for MMA as a sport, has fucking ruined MMA fighters. I would be very shocked if we ever see another person demand the payments that Conor McGregor is demanding in our lifetime. I'd be very shocked.
I mean, we're getting John Jones demanded, but he's not
No
getting
way.
it.
No way.
No,
no way.
He's not, and I think there's an interesting thing going on at the moment with these cuts. Are the cuts over? Are they continuing? I don't know.
No. I think look. This is the other negative point that I've written about the UFC specifically, and that's that in this content era, the true way to kill personality in the UFC as predominantly as possible is by removing the old guard, if you will, and introducing a steady stream of essentially amateur UFC fighters from the Dana White Contender Series, Dana White looking for a fight, tough, etc., etc. And there's a B league of MMA now, a B league of the UFC that is essentially filling the bottoms of cards. I think what we saw in the last year with COVID is there are fighters that are 2-0, 3-0, getting shots at the UFC that never would have happened in the Joe Silva era, unless you're Max Holloway. But, there is a very, very different way that the UFC are operating now. And it has everything to do with the UFC as a brand and so little to do with the actual product that they're putting out.
Yeah, well, that's just it. It's the fact that these guys who have been in the UFC for years, that 5 years ago would never be cut under the same circumstances. Like, if we shifted the UFC model to 5 years ago, Alistair Overeem would never have been let. Alistair Overeem has been cut, hasn't he? Before I said something
JDS.
Really stupid. Cool, yeah. Okay, he would never be let go. I really panicked there because I know what you're like with people making stupid mistakes.
Right, look,
I'm living the Rob Font thing still to this day.
When we were talking about, I can't remember who we were talking about. We were talking about somebody, and it was a well-known fighter. And I was going to ask Alex if he knew them, but I refrained. So,
well, to get back to my point, these guys would never have been cut before. But part of the thing I think has driven this, and it's not just the ESPN deal; it's also the fact that they bought the UFC for way more than they probably should have done, went and shat the bed when they realised that, oh God, Alistair Overeem's on a contract where he gets paid, a house every fight? Like a mansion.
It was $800,000 flat every fight.
What the fuck? Like, if you're going to talk about like people being paid on their merits, maybe if other people were getting paid that, but I don't think Alistair Overeem's drawing in more views than other people, but not that much more. Not like $800,000 worth more. So I do understand why he's been cut under the circumstances, but it will be very interesting because it has been a very sudden. All of these guys who are staples in the UFC, cut them all, and let's see what happens with the sport now. Because now they're having a big focus on homegrown talent and content. And I'm interested, it's been very weird to judge it over the past year because of COVID, but it will be interesting to see how it develops over the next 5 or so years.
So how I see this going, and one of the reasons why I think they cut Overeem, is because, as you say, he's on this is what's hilarious, right? Alistair Overeem has won titles in every major organization he's fought in, right? But because he's not currently providing a return on investment, they determine that he's too high. And to pay a fighter who is as storied as Alistair Overeem, who has the legend status that Alistair Overeem, $800,000 is a literal piss in the wind, right? You're talking that Conor goes and fights Floyd and makes 100 million, and Floyd makes 200 million or whatever he makes. If you go and look at Anthony Joshua fighting Tyson Fury, they're both making hundreds of millions for that fight, right? And then there's Alistair Overeem, who's essentially the equivalent to one of those guys in his day, right? Maybe not right now. And he's getting cut because he's making 800 grand. Like, I think there's two things that I'm going to say. The first is that now more than ever, the UFC is treating every fighter like an investment. And if there is no return on investment, then there's no fighter, essentially, right? That's the reason why we're seeing Conor return, because any Conor fight does massive numbers. He could be fighting Alex, right? And it's massive numbers,
Everyone would want to see that.
I mean, I'm not sure everyone would want to see that, but I'd want to see that. But the other thing that I will say is, when we look at things, if we look at the major sports organizations, the NBA, the NFL, and the UFC, right? We just look at those three things. When you look at the pay scale sharing, the NBA is 50%, right? So teams take 50% and players take 50%. The NFL, I think, is slightly higher than that. I think it's like 55% or something like that. The UFC is something dismal, like 13%, right? Now, it could be that, as Robbie has said, Endeavour have bought the UFC for $4 billion, thinking that everyone's like Conor McGregor, but I doubt it. Right? I genuinely feel if somebody tried to buy the NBA, not that that's possible, but if somebody tried to buy the NBA, the amount would be staggeringly more than $4 billion. Right? Instead, I feel like what's happened is a business has taken over that doesn't give a fuck about MMA as a sport. Instead, they give a fuck about money. Primarily, right? And that's why we're seeing this sort of change towards content rather than fights. Because as we've already alluded to, and we already made the points, Joe Silva, Lorenzo Frank, and Dana, to some extent, cared about MMA. They cared about good fights. They cared about what they wanted to see, what fans wanted to see. ESPN seemingly, Endeavour seemingly, care way less, and it's about bottom lines rather than the future of MMA.
I think it was also a concern. I think when the whole purchase was happening, it was. I mean, I remember it myself, and I think many people were asking this question: is like, if Endeavour's buying the UFC, is it just going to become an entertainment business? Rather than what it was before, which was somewhat of an entertainment business, but also kind of a sport, like trying to be a sport organization. And I think that question's probably been answered, where we have seen a shift towards more of an entertainment side of things, and shifting towards producing enough content and producing future fighters that will produce that content.
I think that just dive into your point a little bit more, Alex. I think the difference is how you give a definition of entertainment, right? So in the Zuffa era, the definition of entertainment was the fights are entertaining, right? Now, yes, the fights have to be somewhat entertaining, but it's more now the drama has to be entertaining, right? So it's going to be, oh, Draco Close got concussion from Jeremy Stevens pushing him at a press conference. Ion Kutalaba decided he was going to try and head snap a guy at a weigh-in, right? Like what social media barb was made from this press conference or that press conference, or Sean O'Malley's Twitch streaming. Let's use that. Let's use this. It's an amalgamation of entertainment to be more conducive to engagement in the UFC as a brand than the fights necessarily, I think.
Well, then it's a development from what we said earlier about it's about, you get title shots based on what you do outside of the cage rather than inside of the cage. It's almost a development of that. It's not just title shots now, it's your entire value is based on not just trash talk, but everything
Social
you
media
do
presence
outside of the cage as well as
100%.
inside of the cage.
100%, 100%. And I think I just want to make this point too, is the UFC want and need stars more than ever, but they want stars on a Sean O'Malley budget, not on a Conor McGregor budget, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what Kamaru Usman made for his last fight. Maybe somebody can pull that up. But it will be metric tons less than, I think it was 700 grand or maybe $1 million, something like that. But he'll be getting pay-per-view points because, Ali Abdelaziz and all that stuff, he'll have been looked after financially. But Conor McGregor's talking 6 mil for the Dustin Poirier fight, probably more than that for the rematch, the rubber match. There's no, if that is, and like that to me tells you everything. The merit system is based on a return on investment. If Kamaru Usman and Conor McGregor got in the cage, I would be as confident I was when Masvidal and Usman got in the cage. 1, size difference. 2, skill disparity. 3, activity, etc., etc., etc. The improvements that we've seen Usman make in whatever, we're not going to get into a breakdown. But that is not based on fighting merit. That is based on who they are.
And really, we are moving from the star era of the UFC to, what would you call it, the profit era?
Yeah, because the juxtaposition that we've got here is, as we've already alluded to, the pay-per-view buys don't mean anything anymore because ESPN are paying Endeavor and paying the UFC a fixed figure because they have to have a certain number of events per calendar year, right? The UFC could go out and put on, I don't know, a replica of UFC 100 or a replica of UFC 200, right? And do 6 million pay-per-view buys. Let's just say, let's be egregious. 600 million pay-per-view buys. 6 million pay-per-view buys, right? And that's amazing for them. They're going to rake in tons of money, yeah? However, they could just as easily put Michael Chiesa versus Neil Magny at the top of a card, right? And they'd make the same guaranteed money. So yes, I'm sure that there is somebody in Endeavor that's looking at maximizing profits, and the maximizing profits is a fight like John Jones versus Francis Ngannou, for instance, right? But it's Francis Ngannou versus John Jones on a budget. Yeah. It's not let's pay these fighters what they're worth. It's not let's pay these fighters what we've determined to be necessary for the damage they're taking, the amount of time they've put into this, etc., etc. Instead, it's John Jones wants 10 million. We'll give him 2 and he can fuck off.
So, we're feeling optimistic about the future of the UFC?
Alex, do you want to take that first, and then I'll bolt on to whatever points you've got?
It depends, right? It depends from what perspective you wanna take it.
Absolutely.
Because to an extent, I do feel optimistic because I still do think that the best fighters or people who are interested in fighting at a high level still will come to the UFC. And I think from just a sport perspective, I mean, we are seeing improvements and it's going to be exciting either way. I think from like seeing how the sport progresses. Yeah, not so happy about the fact how fighters are going to be treated though, and I think that's the maybe other perspective to take.
So I agree with Alex that it is a determination on how you view optimism and pessimism and what you're looking for. I feel like from a hardcore fan's perspective, the UFC could very quickly derail their engagement with the sport if the best fights aren't made. However, if we look at a Bellator, let's just say, I don't know if you guys have been to a Bellator event live and a UFC event live. They're very, very different experiences. And I would say that the UFC is far superior at this current time. Right? Bellator have a long way to go from a foundational level. Cool, they've put a ranking system in now. That's really good. But there's no structured TV deal here in the UK, right? There's fights you've got to go and watch on YouTube 6 days later. There's, it's on Sky now. Actually, it's on the BBC. Actually, it's going to be on iPlayer. And actually, it's going to be on Facebook now, and it's going to be here. That can't continue, right? The UFC have still got such a brand and such a stakehold of the market of MMA that there would be a lot that they would need to fuck up to turn the casual fans away from the UFC, right? However, I think that to your point about the best fighters wanting to go to the UFC, I'm not sure that's true, right? For now, that's definitely the case because they will definitely make the most amount of money in the UFC if they reach the top. Mm-hmm. But the more that we see these other organizations progressing, LFA, Bellator, Ryzen, the more that we see them progress, right? The more, like LFA, this season of LFA has got Roy McDonald, it's got Pettis, it's got Ray Cooper III, it's got Brendan Loughnane. This is the best season we've ever seen in terms of noteworthy names in LFA's history, right? So the more that continues, the more options that there are for fighters who, let's not get this twisted, they're prize fighters. They want to get paid as much as possible for their craft. The more that the UFC move away from a model where it's easier for a prize fighter who determines himself based on skills inside the cage to become financially better off, the more that they're going to look at other options, right? And we know that Bellator have got money. We know they're backed by a company that have got money. Don't think Anthony Johnson has gone to Bellator because they're paying him peanuts. Don't think Yoel Romero's gone to Bellator because they're paying him peanuts, right? They've gone there because that's where the money is. For Yoel Romero to leave the UFC at 40 years of age on a solid wage means this is happening. Yeah?
Yeah. And that is, I guess, the one... Well, I think there are... To add to that point specifically, that is the one thing that jumped to mind when they are cutting people like Yoel Romero, where it is a pure return on investment. They still carry a huge star power, whether it's within the UFC or otherwise. So I am interested to see over the next few years. The UFC perhaps may not have the quality that we want from fights, but what I am very optimistic about is the development of other organizations. And I think that other organizations coming up can only be good for the sport and for fighters especially. But I think that's probably a topic for another podcast to talk about competition. So we won't dive into that. But the other thing is, I think that with this cutting off of the old guard and the focus on the Contender Series and Dana White looking for a fight, it is almost as if the UFC is focusing more on more junior fighters. So it's moving a lot of senior fighters to other organizations and having a greater focus on more junior fighters. I don't know exactly what that means for how the UFC is going to look in 5 years, but it almost feels like I get that they're maximizing profits, but it almost feels like they're moving closer to their competitors than they need to.
So to me, what this is, right, is if you're Manchester United Football Club, right, and you take an academy full of players, maybe one of those players is the next Cristiano Ronaldo, right? Maybe one of those players is the next Lionel Messi. Maybe one of those players is the next, I don't know, Paul Scholes, right?
So it's a risk. It's a relatively low risk it's a high risk to reward ratio. So the reward is very high for a relatively low risk.
Yeah, because let's think about it this way: if you
overconfuse that,
you've got a vastly fluid number of fighters that are coming in, right? Essentially, an endless stream of fighters coming in, and you basically put them on an apprenticeship under the UFC banner, right? We know because Sean O'Malley was signed to a developmental contract. Mackenzie Dern was signed to a developmental contract. What's Ben Askren's son? What's his name?
The guy who
Chase Hooper
wants
Chase Hooper was signed
the guy who wants candy after fights.
Yeah, he was signed to a developmental contract, right? We're going to see more of this. Sean O'Malley, Mackenzie Dern, these sorts of guys that what you're going to see is hundreds of fighters come through and a couple make it. And as Alex has already said, it's super low risk because people come in looking at the brand. If you don't spark something in that apprenticeship, you just moved on. And then a Bellator pick you up, a PFL pick you up, an Invicta pick you up, whoever. If you manage to spark interest, well, then you get into the UFC, right?
Yeah.
And even the fighters that spark half an interest, they're going to be the cannon fodder at the very base of the rankings, right? And as it stands right now, most of the rankings, most of the divisions are in a relatively healthy place, right? For the next 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years. But to me, it's what happens after that. When that era of fighters have gone, are the UFC saved by the work that they've put in previously? And the evolution of MMA brings together this vast swath of new breed of fighters that are so much more dominant, so much more well-rounded, and such a better representation of what MMA is, and they all want to fight for the UFC, right? Or do the other organizations that have profit as a secondary motivation or a third motivation, and the primary motivation is the furthering of MMA and the furthering of fighters, do they rise high enough to challenge the UFC? I think this is what we're going to see in the next 5 to 6 years when it comes to MMA.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please consider subscribing to the podcast and checking us out on YouTube, Facebook and Instagram under the name Combat Thoughts. We'll see you next time.